Welcome everyone to our 13th webinar on the CSA Z1011, the Work Disability Management System Standard. In this session, we're going to continue the conversation on the labor perspective. We had an earlier session on this topic, and we'll continue the conversation here today with our two panelists. So in this session, we'll be giving you an introduction to the CSA Group and the standards development process. That'll follow with a high-level summary of the standard with a focus on the role of labor and unions. And then we'll get into our fireside chat with our two panelists, during which we'll also include questions and comments from attendees. The people speaking today are myself, Emile Tompa. I'm the director of the Center for Research on Work Disability Policy. Lina Lopez, who's a project manager with the CSA Group. And our two panelists are Alec Farquhar and McKenna. Alec is currently the coordinator of Asbestos Free Canada and chair of engagement for the Center for Research on Work Disability Policy. McKenna is national representative for the Canadian Union of Public Employees. So let's start off with the background on the CSA Group and the development process for standards. Lina, do you want to take it away from here?
Yes, good afternoon or a good day to everyone that is on this call. I'm Lina Lopez. I'm going to go through, I'm hoping to answer why and how standards are developed. So if I could just ask someone to move into the next slide, please. Thank you. So here on the screen, if you are able to see it, just a bit of background information about CSA. CSA Group is a 100-year organization that is based here in Canada, headquartered in Toronto as well. It's non-governmental, independent. At CSA, there's two areas of business. There is the commercial area, which you may recognize from the testing certification, the CSA marking, from hockey helmets to your household plumbing. And on the other side, you have the standards development organization, and that's where standards are created. If I can have someone move to next. So with the standards area, it comprises of volunteer individuals. There are currently 10,000 volunteer members. There are 3,000 standards, and there are I'm going to say over 1,000 technical committees. Next slide. So the slide here, the standard that we're going to be speaking about, the Z1011 Disability Management Standard, is in part of the focus area of occupational health and safety. It also falls into the area of focus, which is health and well-being. And what you see on the screen here, there are at CSA in Standards Development Organization, there are 12 areas of focus. So we can just hit next, please. So with the cycle of a standards development process and how it all begins, it starts with, just here looking at the screen, it starts with either a need from either an individual has identified it or an organization. Once it is approved and it seems valid, a technical committee of volunteers comes together from multiple perspectives, come together to develop a standard. So they're at what I used to say a table, now it's a virtual space coming together to bring different perspectives on an area of, for example, on process. And then once refined, it becomes a draft standard. It then moves into a public review where CSA seeks the input of the public to refine the standard. It then comes back and goes through the cycle, as you can see on the screen, into a published standard. It becomes disseminated, and it is a living document for 5 years. And during that 5 years, the public is welcome to send in questions, ask for interpretations about the standard, specifically to the clauses that are written in the standard. And at that time, the committee is also meeting to look at how the landscape has changed or is changing. So when it is up for review at that 5-year mark, the better idea whether that standard should be maintained as it is or if it should be updated. So here on the screen, you'll see we often get the question, well, is it because it's a standard? Is it mandated? And just to let everyone know, standards are volunteer unless they are regulated or put into legislation. A lot of times organizations may use a standard, may adopt it for the reasons that it improves the safety of an organization. It creates harmonization among a business, about trade sectors, as well as it often becomes adopted later on, becomes referenced in legislation because the standard has been developed through multiple perspectives. It's based on consensus, as well as it's easier for the government to put into regulation because it's less expensive. There's already a document that has been developed and produced. Next slide. So how to get involved. So if you are interested in becoming or being involved on the technical committee, please feel welcome to email me afterwards. There's also the CSA community of interest that you can join just to be part of that conversation, as well as during the public review. You can sign up to that website and just be updated anytime a draft document is produced, that you're welcome to review it and provide any comments should you wish. So that is everything as a whole. I want to thank everyone. Next slide, and then over to you, Emile.
Thanks, Lina. Okay, I'm going to just give a brief overview of the standard. On this slide, I have an overview of the technical committee that developed the standard. Myself, Emile Tompa, I was the chair of the technical committee. We had two vice chairs, Emile Danny and David Brown, and the CSA project managers were Lina Lopez and David Shanahan. There were also 26 voting members and several non-voting members on the technical committee. And on that technical committee, there was extensive efforts to ensure there was a balanced representation from a broad variety of stakeholder groups. And I have them listed here. There were a number of employer representatives, some labor and union representatives, injured and disabled worker representatives, health and safety professionals. We also had return to work specialists, some experts in work disability prevention, work disability insurance program providers, and people like myself, academics and researchers who represented the knowledge base that we drew on for developing the standard. So on this slide, I have a list of all the technical committee members. I've highlighted the labor and union representatives in red. In total, there were 7 people who represented that perspective. So it was a good representation across the technical committee for the labor perspective. Now, the purpose of the standard is to provide a consensus-based framework for the management of work disability at the organizational level. And it's really meant to address both physical and mental health needs of workers. So it's broadly encompassing of all health needs of workers. It's also relevant for both work-related and non-work-related health needs of workers. So it's not just about workers' compensation issues, but also other health needs of workers, whether they're work exposures from work or exposures outside of work. It also includes a consensus-based guidance for recruitment, hiring, and onboarding of workers with disabilities. And in the document, there's some supporting materials provided in the annex that include some tips for implementation. Now, the standard takes a systems approach, and this is really critical for a management system standard, because traditionally in this area, the approach that has been used is to assign the role to a person, a work disability manager. This particular person might sit within the human resources department or within the occupational health and safety department. They often handle workers' compensation claims separately and differently than non-work-related injuries and illnesses, simply because there's different programs for these different types of exposures and etiologies. Some organizations even farm out the disability management function. In general, organizations seem to take a reactive approach, particularly to the performance and measurement of their system. They often use lagging indicators such as absence days to evaluate the performance of their system. Whereas the systems approach is really meant to be proactive and consider the roles and responsibilities across the organization. Everyone in the organization plays a role in the systems approach. It considers inputs, the process, outputs, and feedback on a continual basis. So what is a management system? Now, preferably, an organization has a formalized framework of policies, processes, and procedures to meet its objectives. It's based on a documented and tested step-by-step approach. It's aimed at smooth functioning through standard practices, and audits really play a vital role in the management systems approach because what gets measured gets done. And ideally, an organization really has such a framework in place for all its core organizational activities, including work disability management. So the systems approach to work disability management is really designed to ensure clarity, consistency, and integration with all of the other organizational activities. So this particular standard promotes a proactive approach. It addresses health needs of workers before they become disabling. We sometimes use the vocabulary of work disability prevention to describe this phenomenon because it's meant to prevent health conditions from becoming disabling, whether those health needs arise from exposures at work or elsewhere. So the management systems model I have represented here starts off with policies. So policies really play a fundamental role in setting clear directions for the organization to follow. Subsequently, you need to have management structures in place to deliver on those policies. It requires a planned and systematic approach to implementing those policies. And it follows with emphasizing measurement and performance against targets to really identify needed improvements. And then review and learning from those experiences are fundamental to that continual improvement process, which is the basis of a management systems approach. There's 6 guiding principles that are at the foundation of this standard. The first is that it's based on an evidence-informed, data-driven approach that is strategic in nature. It really focuses on inclusion and accessibility to ensure worker engagement and belonging in the process. It really takes a worker-centered supportive approach and contextualize things on a case-by-case basis. Accommodation and early return to work are considered within the essential duties of a worker's role within the organization. It takes a joint responsibility approach between the organizational management, the worker and workforce, and worker representatives wherever applicable. And legal compliance is the starting point as applicable within the organization's jurisdiction, because the assumption is that organizations are compliant with the minimum requirements of the law. This standard is voluntary, so it goes over and above those minimum requirements. Now, in this slide, I have an overview of the table of contents of the standard. There's 7 chapters. 4 core chapters are highlighted there, chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7. I'll give a little bit more detail about those 4 chapters in the subsequent slide. And then there's a number of informative annexes that help with the implementation of the standard. The core sections of the standard are listed here. Chapter 4 is on work disability management systems. It emphasizes involvement of all of the key stakeholders. This is really essential because everyone has to play a role, and it really ensures that the foundations are in place for a strong system. I have a little bit more detail from this chapter. Section 4.33 is on organizational responsibilities, and I've highlighted in red here some of the details that pertain to workers and their representatives. So the organization shall encourage stakeholders to work collaboratively, ensure the internal stakeholders, including workers, and where appropriate, their representatives, as well as immediate supervisors, have timely access to information relevant to the work disability management system, including accommodation and return to work. The organization shall also ensure existing and relevant workplace committees are engaged, ensure the supervisors have the right skill sets to respond to health needs of workers, and ensure workers' rights to privacy are respected and protected. A little bit more detail on the worker's role. So worker participation is really essential for a work disability management system. It includes active participation in the treatment, rehabilitation, stay at work, and return to work process. So worker participation shall include being involved in the healthcare treatment process, the consideration of job and workplace accommodations, barriers or impediments to return to work and identifying those barriers, assisting in the return to work planning, as well as assisting in establishing, implementing, evaluating, and maintaining the work disability management system standard. So in chapter 5, the planning chapter, it really emphasizes the need for the organization to understand its strengths, identify where there's areas for improvement, and identify what appropriate targets to reach for in a particular planning cycle. In Chapter 6, it emphasizes emphasizes the importance of a well thought out plan to achieve that success. And then Chapter 7 focuses on performance measurement, because what gets measured gets done. So now we will turn to our two panelists, Alec Farquhar and Tom McKenna. You're both present here. So I think, Alec, did you want to turn on your camera? I think Tom, you said you weren't going to turn on your camera.
No, my apologies.
Okay, not a problem. Okay, so maybe we'll start off with a brief bio from both of you. So do you want to start off, Alec, with giving a bit of background about your labor representation and your history in this area?
Thank you very much, Emile, and hello, everyone. I'm Alec Farquhar, and I'm not a labor representative per se. I've been on the worker side for most of my career, but I have to say I've also been on the employer side. So it's a little bit varied. I've mostly been an injured worker advocate under the Ontario Workplace Safety Insurance Act. I've also been very involved in issues around disability and employment, and in a general kind of way, advancing that through my whole career in Ministry of Labor, at the Office of Worker Advisor, the Occupational Health Clinics for Ontario Workers, and very often, I've been part of collaborative efforts to bring employers and labor together, exactly as the standard has done. So I'm really excited about being here today.
Thank you, Alec. Tom, do you want to give a bit of background for yourself?
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Tom McKenna, and I'm currently a health and safety representative as well as a workers' compensation appeals advocate. I've been in these roles for almost 26 years now. I'm going into my 26th year. My primary focus for most of my career has been occupational health and safety, and the link between that and workers' compensation appeals, getting workers back to work safely, durably, either through attendance management programs in the workplace, using human rights principles, vocational rehabilitation, return to work, etc.
Thank you, Tom. And so we have some questions for the two of you, and we're also taking questions from attendees. You can do that through the chat box or the question and answer box. So feel free to submit your questions and we'll try to integrate them into the discussion. So to start off with, I thought we'd talk about the highlights of the standard. So what do you see as the highlights of this new standard? What are the key benefits for labor, workers, and management? And one of the things we thought we'd talk a little bit about is the business case as well. So Alec, do you want to start us off? Yeah, I think you're muted, Alec.
There I am.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Neil. I was on the technical committee for the standard, but I thought for this session here, it would be important to speak especially from a sort of higher level of realizing that pretty well everybody who's attending is probably thinking about, might this standard work in my workplace? How do I get it introduced? What are the high level benefits? So a standard like this provides all the workplace parties with a framework for a more systemic approach. My guess is that most people that are on this Zoom call are part of a workplace where perhaps it's not a systemic approach, and you're looking for a way to bring these issues together and make a bigger impact. So the standard can help you set benchmarks. It can help the workplace parties make progress together. And I wanted to emphasize, being a CSA standard, it's linked to the full suite of occupational health and safety standards. I'm on the steering committee for the CSA Health and Safety Standards myself. And you may find that your workplace, although it hasn't implemented this standard, has implemented some other OHS standard from CSA, which gives you a really good start and a really good chance people understand what we're trying to accomplish. Sometimes there are even supply chain benefits for an employer to be linked with CSA standards and be able to say, we brought this into our workplace, we're bringing a systemic approach. Now, the key benefits for unions, workers, and management. Emile, you mentioned earlier that in a lot of workplaces, work disability management and prevention are not systematized or integrated. And In fact, sometimes it's almost seen as a niche issue to be handled by somebody in HR, perhaps by a disability management specialist, sometimes somebody who isn't even in the workplace who's retained, often on a case-by-case basis. And in a unionized environment, this can, I would say, often lead to a lot of disputes and grievances or litigation. You can also encourage a technical, sometimes polarized approach versus a problem-solving approach. So you'll get a union rep who really knows all the rules in the collective agreement and knows the case law, whatever it might be. And then an employer representative who's virtually grown up in that environment, from the other perspective. And of course, we're having this session today because we believe that a standard can be a tremendous resource to the workplace where you don't have to reinvent a process. It's there for you to adopt. It provides a foundation for collaboration. It can contribute to improved labor relations and productivity, in addition to the specific human and financial benefits for disability management. So I'll finish off with just a few comments on a business case. My guess is, and I could be wrong, but certainly from other calls, it's been similar, that most people who are attending today can't just go implement the CSA standard in their workplace. You've got to make a business case to make it happen, whether it's for the union or for the employer. So a business case is often seen as a sort of a technical step, a checkbox step. Well, if I prove this or that, then I'll get approval for this, and then off to the races. I really want to emphasize that a business case is just the start, and you want this to go deep. So the business case is your opportunity to go deeper. Don't just treat it as a technical exercise. Treat it as a collaborative partnership building exercise. So for example, the costs of workplace disability are often not well understood in the workplace, whether they're the human or economic costs. It's not at all unusual for the financial costs to be in separate silos. One budget for workers' comp, one for sick pay, a premium paid for long-term disability, and no one's really tracking it. The costs aren't seen comprehensively. Some costs might not even be seen to be related to disability at all. So it's really important to have an exercise where you bring all the relevant information into focus. The hard figures, I mentioned sick pay, long-term disability, workers' comp, but also financial costs such as the cost of grievance-related litigation, which can run to the hundreds of thousands of dollars for union and employer in a big company. Costs that are harder to quantify are often only obtainable from surveys of the staff or other qualitative approaches such as focus groups. And that includes something really important, the extent of presenteeism, which is workers are present, but they're not functioning to their full capacity. Or something like worker trust. Does the worker actually trust the employer to be a safe place to disclose disability as early as possible? A good business case isn't just a one-off, let's get approval through these figures. It has to include benchmarks and indicators, which you can use in future to show that this whole investment of time and energy and money is working, or perhaps not working. And the business case shouldn't just be a dry document. It needs to really resonate with the employer, the union, and the workers. It has to be real for them. It has to attract deep commitment to carry you through the challenges of implementation and the bumps in the road. So ideally, my perfect workplace would be one where you develop the business case collaboratively, and I have been part of that. This is not a pipe dream. It's happened. Final comment. Business cases often focus on disability cost and not at prevention. That is, looking at the root cause and improving occupational health and safety in particular, both for the injured worker, any disabled worker, and for all the other workers. An example I often use of this is ergonomics action teams that are linked to management and response to ergonomic related disabilities. So as you can see, I'm advocating a business case that's real, that's deep, that forms a foundation for future collaboration.
Thank you, Alex. That was really comprehensive, and I like that broad look at the business case. It goes far beyond just some computations to sell it to upper management, and thinking really about how it kind of reaches into all facets of an organization, including, like you said, absenteeism, presenteeism, job satisfaction, maybe turnover, number of other really important measures that are sometimes hard to quantify, but are really critical aspects of a well-functioning organization when they're doing a good job of being people-oriented and focusing on health and productivity across the organization. Tom, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so when you look at the business case, I think you need to look at who is your audience, who is a stakeholder. I think the current standard is a strongly preferred approach versus attendance management programs. That's been the paradigm for the last 20, 30 years, because it coordinates human rights, workers' compensation, return to work, collective agreement entitlements, et cetera. For employers, when we look at this is a really good approach, the standard, because you're going to be getting productive workers in durable, safe return to work, which maximizes their morale and their capabilities. The standard emphasizes looking at limitations, what I can't do, restrictions, what I shouldn't do, and capabilities, what I can do. Now, for workers, we all know that the focus needs to be on a safe and durable return to work. And you really need to look at the biopsychosocial approach, which this standard does. All aspects of return to work, the mental, the physical. It also focuses on individualized ongoing assessments, which is very important because return to work, whether it's accommodation under human rights or something else, isn't just a one-time thing. It can happen multiple times. It can be quite extensive or just a brief, hey, we're going to meet again in a few months to review how you're doing. It also looks at episodic disabilities and mental health. And like was mentioned earlier on, presenteeism. Presenteeism is a growing issue in the workplace, and it directly and heavily overlaps with things like episodic disabilities. Now, for unions, unions often focus on assisting members as per the various legislation on duty of fair representation, et cetera, but there's more than that. There's collective agreement obligations, there's human rights obligations. When we look at the workplace, we have found that new and young workers, older workers, and workers in precarious employment are often at much higher risk for injury and occupational disease. What this standard does, it's adaptable enough that it can incorporate all of this. From a health and safety perspective, this standard aligns with the basic health and safety principle of the Plan, Do, Check, Act, with plan being policies and procedures, do being the implementation part of the process, check being monitoring and evaluation, and act being review and assessment. In terms of the uptake and how to get this into the workplace, having broader adoption, I think it's really crucial for people to know what their roles and responsibilities are as per section 4.3.3, organizational responsibilities. And sometimes there's a lot of confusion over this. Well, I'm the worker, what do I need to do? I'm a union, what do I need to do? I'm the employer, especially in a smaller workplace. The core sections of the standard, which you mentioned earlier on, sections 4, 5, 6, and 7, easily address this. Again, this standard, highly adaptable, it's layperson friendly. For me, the key section is section 5, planning, which you can use to map out addressing disability in the workplace, identifying gaps, barriers, and opportunities. And finally, the annual review of the successes and the challenges of the program. This whole standard has been set up for a variety of workplaces, whether they be small or large, in any kind of sector, federal or provincial. We've provided a lot of different examples and resources and links for uptake. And I think that's a major selling point. Here are some samples that you can use in Appendix 8, Annex H. Annex H gives examples of here's how this can be applied in the workplace. And it gives examples of how it could be applied in a small workplace or a large one. This allows for greater uptake and refinement.
Thanks, Tom. I just want to remind the audience that we'll take questions, and you can do that through the question and answer box or the chat box. So feel free to send us some questions for our panelists today. We'll move on to our second question. How can labor and unions support uptake of the standard in organizations? And do you think the business case is a good way to do that, to promote amongst the constituents? And do you have other suggestions on how to facilitate uptake of the standard? And Tom, let's start off with you this time.
For question number 2?
Yes.
So again, for unions for uptake of the standard, what I would be doing is, first of all, you need to assess your own workplace and your own membership. What size of a local are we? How many members do we have? What is the age, the demographics of our membership? Once you know what the needs of your membership are, the injury rates, the average age, the types of injuries, the types of occupational disease, you can then go to the employer and say, okay, here's our needs assessment. Here's how we're going to be working with you to develop a plan using the standard. I think for me, as a union representative, as a workers' compensation representative, health and safety representative, this would be the starting point. Okay, how can we adapt this standard to our workplace? What do our members really need? What are the average injury rates? How long? What's the duration of these kinds of injuries? When you know that, then you can approach the employer, the members, the various departments, and apply the standard and say, hey, okay, we have had grievances. We've had issues in the past with duty to accommodate that may be interrupted. They may not be sufficient and may not have looked at limitations and restrictions sufficiently, or just looked at one and not the other. That communications aspect, where they look at one element of a human rights duty to accommodate approach as opposed to everything, that has been a major problem for a lot of unions. Again, I mentioned attendance management in the past. That's an outdated approach that this standard, I really strongly believe, replaces, because it looks at it 360 degrees. It takes a lot of variables into account. Again, coordination. It's key, because I will have one member approach me, hey, I have a workers' compensation claim. How do I get back to work? Later on in the process, that may have to overlap with long-term disability or sick leave while they're waiting for their claim to be accepted, or duty to accommodate once their workers' compensation claim, WSIB claim, concludes. Previous approaches to disability in the workplace haven't addressed all that together like this standard does. And that would be a major selling point for this standard.
Thank you. And are you framing that as sort of a business case as well, or is that something beyond sort of the approach that you're suggesting?
Both, because in a business case, if I were an employer, okay, do I need expertise in workers' compensation? Then I have to find human rights expertise. Then I have to find expertise with respect to health and safety. Someone's been injured, I have to address those issues. Oh, there's long-term disability as well. You don't need a whole suite of consultants. This standard can be used to approach all of those and integrate all of those. There is a lot of savings in terms of coordination, in terms of morale, in terms of getting people back to work safely without the risk of getting re-injured. You'll find that where return to work occurs prematurely, there is a fairly high rate of people either getting re-injured or going off again due to a related condition. That prolongs the process. It could go on for literally years. So from a business case perspective, by coordinating all this, you look at these potential problems in advance, and that's a key component of this. When you look at the gaps and the barriers at the very beginning, as per Section 5, like I mentioned earlier on, you can avoid a lot of this. This will save a lot of time, a lot of energy for employers, a lot of money for workers, morale, frustration.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Tom. So it sounds like you're really promoting a win-win where there's something in it for the organization, for management, as well as labor.
Absolutely, yes.
So I'm going to move on to our next set of questions. Starting off with the first one here, I have many unions have a lot of in-house expertise in various disability management issues. So can you suggest how employers could tap into this expertise when adopting or expanding their work disability management system? And they might think about what roles labor union will play in the policy program and development process. And they also obviously play roles in the implementation on a case-by-case level basis as well. So Alec, do you want to start off with this question here?
So this is really interesting because what Tom was looking at, I think, and it's really important again for everyone My guess is everyone on the call, you've got at least a slightly different workplace situation or sectoral or national situation you're facing. And similarly with in-house expertise of the unions, there's quite a range of types of people, types of roles. I would say most unions, maybe all unions, have significant expertise on disability issues at the national, provincial, and local level. Why? It's because disability is one of the main issues where members feel vulnerable. They feel they need the support of their union. They may not trust the employer, so they bring their issue to the union, and by and large, it's, at least initially, usually for individual problem solving. Now, Tom mentioned some within unions, quite often there are silos where maybe there's a workers' compensation rep who works quite separately from a benefit rep, or perhaps from a human rights disability advocate. But I am seeing more and more unions starting to bring these areas together because it's so much more powerful when you can get some integration. Another really key fact, the majority of union experts will have come to their role as advocates. Some will even be in an elected role. They're elected to be the workers' comp rep, just for example. And maybe their journey in that area started with what they perceived to be unjust treatment of themselves or their co-workers. So often they'll be advocacy and litigation oriented. In fact, they'll be proud of their wins. I've seen union reps who sort of have a little list of everything they've won. Sometimes they total up all the money they won for workers through the years, and it's powerful stuff, and it's motivating. Now, in extreme cases, and I've seen these, especially in some big organizations, you can have a very combative and litigious environment with frequent recourse to grievances, tribunals, and courts. Negative relationships, person to person, union rep to company rep, which can develop for years and mark the whole labor culture of an organization. And yet at the same time, I see people on both sides who are really longing for a better framework for the relationship. They don't really want to come to work every day to fight with somebody. So you'll have employer disability management staff who genuinely care about the well-being of workers, and they're trapped inside what Tom mentioned, a rule-bound attendance management program. And that puts them inevitably into an adversarial context with workers and union reps. And you'll have union reps who don't want to come in and be fighting with somebody all the time either. So in an ideal world, the implementation of the standard provides a context for a much different approach that gets at root causes, that solves problems systemically, etc. Now, what role might labor and unions play in the policy and program development level? I personally believe for the implementation of the standard to go really deep in the workplace, you have to have collaboration and full involvement of the union right from the outset. There are going to be a lot of models for this, but often it can start with collaboration on defining the current state, doing a scan together, gathering data, doing some survey and focus group work, ways to start the conversation and give us an information base to move forward. I believe there needs to be a formal framework for the relationship. Sometimes it's actually bargained as part of the collective agreement. Sometimes it's a sidebar agreement, and it can't just be at a lower level in the organization. It needs to be actively supported by the leadership of both sides. I found joint training in human rights and disability issues can be really valuable fleshing out the relationship. I've seen workplaces that have even brought in persons with disabilities, often severe ones, to help with that. It really helps you get grounded in how important these things are. The workplace parties can also partner on specific programs, and I've seen this really help the relationship. So maybe they're not ready to partner even around the standard, but they will partner around mental health issues, stress, substance abuse, that kind of thing. And that gives us a foundation for more ambitious work. Unions, remember, aren't just in one workplace, so they can contribute to data banks of accommodation and prevention solutions that work in one sector and maybe could work in this one. Now, finally, the role of unions at the implementation and case level. This is where it succeeds or fails. You can have a great framework, but if it isn't real at the front line, it's not going to succeed. And I believe you need a formal structure to support this. On a systemic level, this should include regular information sharing meetings, some kind of steering committee, an approach, like as Tom mentioned, for the identification and prioritization of issues, action planning on an annual and maybe in a big place, even a monthly basis. And on the case-to-case level, this is where you build or break relationships. I see the approach having to be proactive. Workers must know what the system is. They must feel safe disclosing their disability. Unions can help support workers in disclosing disabilities. Often a worker will feel safer disclosing a disability initially to their union rep versus to the employer. That helps with a proactive approach. And I'll finish off with relationships. I'm a tremendous believer in genuine relationships sort of across divides. There will always be rough moments. There'll be disagreements, but we need to have a context where key people can cut through that and have conversations that will help both parties navigate. So that's the sort of human basis for this standard, which goes so far beyond the formal basis.
Okay, thanks, Alec. Tom, did you want to add to that? You know, how to tap into union expertise to help make the system work as best it can?
No, I think that was a perfect summary of how I would approach the situation. Getting unions on side, on board earlier on is better. If unions are merely a tag on, hey, oh, by the way, we have this process, we have this plan, we have this new standard, we're implementing it, and you're months down the road into it, then you involve the union, it may not come across as the union and workers being equal partners in the process. This may come across as, okay, this is just another approach to attendance management in the workplace. This is the opposite. This standard takes a directly opposite approach. So that is the biggest takeaway for me from this. Get all the stakeholders on side together from the very first day.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Okay, so just remind the audience that we're taking questions through the question and answer box or the chat box. So please feel free to come forward with any questions you might have for our panelists. We'll move on to the next question then. On a practical level, what do organizations and labor unions need to consider in getting started with the uptake of the standard? And thinking about what kind of resources are needed and any suggestions you might have about how to prioritize for the organization and some new ideas for work disability management systems implementation. And Tom, did you want to get started with that question?
Sure. First of all, communicate the standard. Okay, there's a new standard out. What is it? And you want it to be communicated by someone who's knowledgeable about the standard, who can ask, hey, what are your needs and how do they relate to the standard? I think it's important for people to know what is a standard, what can it do for me as a worker in the workplace, how does it address my issues? So communicating what can the standard do, how can it be applied? That'd be a key resource to have in the workplace and a key starting point. Second, the ability to do a needs assessment as per section 5.3.2 of the standard. You want to look at what barriers there are in conjunction with some of the annexes. The annexes provide excellent resources, how-tos on how to apply the standard. For example, Annex H, case studies on reasonable work accommodation. So when you start this process up, what do I need as the employer? What do I need as the union? What are our members telling me? Then you can refine and apply the program and figure, okay, what resource do we need? Do we need to call in an external medical person, an expert of some kind, occupational disease specialist, say if there's a high incidence of asbestos in the workplace or repetitive strain injuries? Using your needs assessment to address barriers and problems, you might realize, okay, one of the very first things we need to do is find out which expert we will need to address these kinds of issues. We'll bring them in at the outset and help them formulate our program under the standard. And again, I think this has been mentioned before. There's another whole series of related standards. The standard Z1011, 18, occupational health and safety training. There's the hazard identification and elimination, risk assessment and control standard. There's psychological health and safety in the workplace. You might have to look at these other standards as well, because if a lot of the issues in the workplace may be mental health related, okay, maybe there are other standards, other resources that we also need to apply along with this one. This standard doesn't stand by itself. It's part of a whole suite. There's numerous CSA group standards that can apply to this one that can be married to it. In terms of priorities, as mentioned before, needs assessment. What is happening in the workplace? What are the drivers of disability in the workplace? Who is being disabled? What is the duration? Are they intermittent? What groups, what demographics are being affected? Then I'd be looking at, okay, what kinds of barriers and gaps are there to putting the standard in the workplace in the first place? Again, looking at section 5.3.2 of the standard. Once you know that, I think for me, the next priority would probably be going to section 4 of the standard. Who takes responsibility for what? You need a lot of role clarity. As a union representative, what am I expected to do? As a manager or a supervisor in the workplace, what am I expected to do? If I'm an external medical provider, an expert, subject matter expert who's being called in, what am I expected to do? As the worker, what do I need to do? When you have role clarity, I think that will address a lot of the problems and confusion that can lead to conflict later on. The next step for me, addressing what kind of disabilities, the primary disabilities and issues in the workplace, as per section 6.2 of the standard. Again, Annex H, the case studies, gives a lot of useful examples of this. And finally, I mentioned this several times, make sure you have the right medical and subject matter experts for getting assistance. And this is covered by Annex B, the role of experts. You want to have the right resources for the right disabilities and return to work in the workplace.
Thanks, Tom. I like the way you connected it with the other standards, because I think I mentioned it, but people may not be realizing that how this standard really fits in well with some of the other CSA standards. So it's not meant to necessarily stand alone, but it's meant to dovetail with any other standards that the organization may have already adopted, whether it's the CSA Z1011, mental health in the workplace, the primary prevention standards, CSA Z1000, or what it's the new, I guess it's the ISO version of it as well, or whether it's the training in the workplace. They're all meant to dovetail together. So it was part of the plan of development of the standard that it fit together with existing standards that organizations have adopted. Alec, did you want to speak to this question as well? How do you get organizations started down the path of adopting the standard?
There we go. Maybe I'll just make one comment. I really agree with everything Tom said. And also wondering if there are any folks on the line that might be thinking this way. I've often found that there's a spark or something in a workplace, or even in a whole sector or set of workplaces, that gets the conversation started. The most common is some kind of a human and or financial impact of a big nature. I've been involved in 2 or 3 where long-term disability costs were skyrocketing, and it became a major cost factor for the employer. And one of them, the employer said, if we can't get this under control, this plant will close. So often it starts with some sense of urgency coming from a specific situation. And I have seen problems sustaining that urgency. So once we bring the standard in and get things under control, we haven't done the deep and sort of long-term work to keep it going properly and keep crises from reemerging. So I guess urging people, don't look at it as sort of a one-time fix. Look at it as a big change in the structure and the, let's say, the culture and the day-to-day realities of your workplace. Look at it long-term.
Okay, thanks, Alec. We have a question from the audience. Someone asks, let's say an employer and union agree to adopt the standard and put it into practice. What key improvements will workers experience?
Hi, Tom here. I think for me, coordination. So if you look at the standard 5.3.2 and looking at B and C, the coordination of programs. Okay, is there sick leave and a workers' compensation claim? Oftentimes the worker is rooted, okay, we're going to address your workers' compensation claim. And then, oh, by the way, you have some long-term disability issues, or you have some sick leave, or there's some collective agreement. This can be a really frustrating process for the worker. These processes in and of themselves are frustrating, time-consuming. The average workers' compensation claim appeal, for example, in British Columbia takes 2 years or more. So by coordinating this, you're giving the worker a map, a roadmap. Hey, here's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be looking at all these things, privacy considerations in place, because we have to be careful about privacy. And this can help ameliorate some of the frustration that the worker may feel. You can address questions right up front.
Alec, did you want to add anything there?
I think Tom's point's really important, and I want to add something about the underlying dynamics in a workplace that are often not known. I was really struck by a media article on the weekend. It was about this hospital in Quebec where an Indigenous woman was mocked during what actually turned out to be her last few hours of life on this earth. And senior management at the hospital was quoted in this article to say they never had a clue this kind of thing was going on. And I'm ready to believe it at a certain level, although not fully, because often senior management, even middle senior management, won't know the realities in the workplace. But we're actually trying to change those deep realities. We're trying to get people treating each other better when no one's looking, if you know what I mean. And I would like to add into Tom's comments the important role of the union mobilizing the members so that it's actually happening, in a sense, from the grassroots. And similarly, the key people on the employer side are mobilizing management. So there's this real commitment and ultimately pride. We're an inclusive workplace. We encourage conversation about disability. We're a safe place to disclose a disability, and we're proud of that. In fact, it's a business advantage for us. So I'm getting more and more interested the later I get in my career in how do you change the way people act even when no one's looking. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks. That's interesting. Yeah, culture change, changing the norms. We have another question from someone who asks, any advice when organizations encounter change fatigue? And I guess that happens a lot. There's so many variables out there in the environment to deal with COVID-19 and working from home. So how do you deal with change fatigue?
Maybe I could start with a comment. I'd love to see what Tom and others think of this. Change fatigue, it can come in a lot of different ways, but it's part of fatigue in general. I'm a real believer in acknowledging when you're fatigued. So finding a safe place to admit we're not everything we should be. And I'm all tired out. I don't know how I can keep going with this. Somehow going deep in that can, as long as it's not leading to a total sense of defeatism, is important, because the contrary would be to sort of pretend that we still have things just the way they should be. And what we really have is the shell of something that used to have content and doesn't have it anymore. So I think a regular check-in where people shouldn't be afraid of saying, I'm tired, I don't know if I can keep going. Honesty.
Thanks, Al. Tom, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, so if you look at section 6.6, managing change, it refers to another standard, a related standard, Z45001. That's another resource that people can look at. My experience, my personal experience with change fatigue has been this: communication, either lack of, insufficient, or people are overwhelmed. There's just too much. So I think managing the communication itself, okay, what kind of messages do we need to have? Are they bite-sized, digestible chunks that directly relate to problems that can be solved in the workplace right now? For me, if you want to sell me on a brand new program or a new protocol or approach to disability in the workplace, okay, give me a message, make it bite-sized, I can digest it quickly, relate it to something that's currently happening right now in the workplace, an issue that can be resolved fairly quickly using this new system that you have in place. I think when you use that kind of approach, it gets people on board more than, okay, we have this 100-page document, highly technical, highly legal, none of which apply to the standard, by the way. And you may see results 3 or 4 years down the road. Wrong approach to use.
Okay, thank you. Okay, someone also just comments, also as long as it's not a token only gesture. So just mentioning that it has to be real.
Can I comment on that,
Yeah,
Emile?
sure. Yes.
I mean, like many people, I'm influenced by, I don't know, presentations I've seen or incidents. I was at a presentation once where a safety consultant was interviewing why health and safety was so messed up in a big manufacturing facility. And it gradually came out, the CEO had never visited the facility. This is like 2,000 workers. The CEO of the company had never been there and didn't know people, essentially. So I do feel that workers' unions will detect when it's a token gesture. That was a very astute question. You have to show it's real and that you're walking the talk. Lots of ways to do that, but there's no substitute for showing up, listening, showing you listen, and what Tom just mentioned, acting.
Thank you. Tom, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, 2 things. So I think as a worker, the litmus test will be this. Do I perceive as an injured worker or worker with a disability that I'm being penalized for my disability? If that isn't occurring anymore under the standard and the processes that are in place, that's a great start. Second, okay, I'm waiting for my workers' compensation claim to be accepted. It could be many weeks or months, especially for mental health related claims, as opposed to the standard 12 to 17 days, depending on the province, from receipt of paycheck or direct deposit. How are my financial issues, putting money into my bank account, going to be addressed? Can you show me how this plan is going to link benefits? I'm waiting for my claim. A decision may not be due for 5 or 6 months. How does this program get me access to sick leave benefits in the interim, or medium-term disability benefits, or some other way of ensuring that my concerns, paying the rent, putting food on the table, are being addressed. My other biopsychosocial concerns, my mental health, my morale, not being abandoned in the workplace, are being addressed.
Thank you, Tom. So we have a minute left. Any last words, Alec or Tom, before we leave for the day and our last session? So it's our last hurrah for the standard through this webinar series.
I'll just say my 2 seconds worth. Okay. This has been a rich experience. For those of you who are just attending for the first time, there's a community out there of people who are passionately committed to a collaborative approach on workplace disability management. Call on us, get in touch with us, share your problems, share your solutions. This is beyond a technical exercise.
Thank you, Alec. Tom?
Yes, for me, I think that we're going to be seeing a second pandemic, unfortunately, a mental health pandemic arising from this, possibly a third one of post-COVID syndrome. I think that we have a unique opportunity here to get ahead of these curves, these potential pandemics, by putting into place these systems now, using the standard.
Okay, thank you so much, both of you. Thank you, Alec. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Lina, and also to Sabrina, who is behind the scenes at managing the session as well. And thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar and this webinar series. If you've been to any of the other ones, as you may know, we do record these sessions, and they are available on the CRWDP website. So you can check that website to see this webinar series recording a few days from now, and the previous ones we've had, as well as they're available on the Canadian Institutes for Safety, Wellness, and Performance at Conestoga College and their website for this webinar series. Lina, do you want to just say any last words?
A couple of words. So I'd encourage everyone to have a look at the standard as you go through the standard. The committee is there to answer any questions, provide any interpretation, and they're constantly looking at the clauses that have been written to be refined for the next version. So I encourage feedback, even though it's past public review. But if you're looking for any interpretation on any section of the standard, it's very much welcome. So that's available.
Okay, and we just got a message from one of the audience members. Great discussion today. Thanks so much. We love to keep the dialogue going on this important topic. So thank you guys, and have a great rest of the day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.